Hey guys, I'm not here today, but I wanted to make sure you guys had an adequate explanation of the activity that you're going to do today. So we call this activity the lunchroom fight, and you should have in front of you three pieces of paper that will help you throughout this activity. The first is one that just says the lunchroom fight across the top and has the paper sack and the apple also. Then there's one that just has names and quotes from each of those individuals. That is your evidence. And then the third is a suspension report, which you can actually set aside. We will get to that at the very, very end. So here's the whole scenario. Imagine you're the principal of a school and you just found out that there was a fight in the lunchroom during lunch. You've asked many students and teachers who witnessed the fight to write down what they saw and who they think started the fight. Unfortunately, you have received many conflicting accounts that disagree not only as to who started the fight, but also as to who was involved and when the fight even started. It's important to remember that in this scenario, no one is just plain lying. So now it's time to think. Why would there be different stories of the event if no one is just plain lying? And what are the different types of people who might have seen this fight? Think about our lunchroom. And what might make one person's story more believable or plausible than another person's? So I want you to actually pause the video here, and I want you to just jot in your notes a little bit your answers to these questions. They do not need to be long or lengthy, but just kind of brainstorm your answers to these questions and then start the video back up when you're ready. Okay, so now that we've kind of thought about all of those questions, your task is going to be to look over the evidence that you have on that second sheet of paper from all those eyewitnesses and others who are somehow connected to the fight. And by the end of the day, you are going to need to determine what happened and provide punishment to the student or students you believe need to be disciplined. When we do this, we're going to want to look at several things. And when you look at the worksheet that you have in front of you, there's background info, evidence, context, sourcing, and corroboration. And so I'm just going to go over what I mean by evidence and context and sourcing and corroboration, and then you can get to work. So first, we got to start with evidence, and those are those different statements or quotes from the individual people who are connected to or witnessed the lunchroom fight. Typically, in a history class, we talk about evidence as primary sources or secondary sources. Primary sources are descriptions of an event from someone who was there to actually experience it or see it or hear it or whatever. And secondary is a description of an event based on research or told by someone who was not there to see it. So if you look at the list that you have, try and figure out which ones were actually there and are therefore a primary source, and which ones weren't there but are somehow connected or know additional information, therefore they are a secondary source. It's also important to remember that when we label something a primary or secondary source, it might be a primary source for this event or a secondary source for this event, but that doesn't mean that they're a primary and secondary source for everything. Okay? The next thing we want to do, and this is really, really important with context and looking at evidence, is contextualization. And so this asks you to determine what was going on at the time of this event and how it may have impacted the evidence or the event overall. If you look at background information, this is a place where it'll kind of give you a little bit of an idea of some of the context as well as the quotes and the evidence. When you're doing this, you're going to want to look at the town context, school context, and cafeteria context. And I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4 just to give you enough space, but you may not have 4 town context ideas or school context ideas. This might be an area where you need to think a little bit outside the box to figure out okay, what was going on that might be relevant to this fight. It will not explicitly state it anywhere, but you're going to have to think about how the little clues that you have might relate to this fight and help you get to the bottom of it. The next thing you're going to want to do is look at sourcing. And sourcing asks you to consider who said each piece of evidence as well as what additional information that they can tell us. So sometimes we have to consider the source, right? And I think we do this in our everyday lives. If you know somebody who's super gossipy and you hear something from them, you consider the fact that they're super gossipy and maybe don't trust them as the most reliable source. This is super important in social studies and history, but it's also super important because the internet's, right? Like the internet has some sources that are really reliable and some that are absolutely not reliable. And so we need to consider that source and whether or not it is a good one for us to use or if it's good for what we actually are trying to figure out. So it might be a good source, just not helpful for us and our purpose. So questions we want to ask ourselves with this is, who wrote this? What do we know about them? What is the author's perspective? Do they have any bias? When was this written? Where was it written? Why was it written? Is this source actually reliable at all? And then once we've figured that out, we want to look at okay, which are the sources that are most reliable? And then we want to corroborate that evidence. We want to actually look at and compare and contrast multiple sources to see if there are points of agreement or disagreement before drawing a conclusion. So for example, just because Ms. Plusinski is a trusted source and you have evidence from me doesn't mean it's actually 100% accurate. You're going to want to look at other pieces of evidence to see if they match what Ms. Plusinski is saying or if they contradict what Ms. Plusinski is saying. So go ahead and once you go through all the evidence, you'll answer those 3 questions about corroboration. And once you're all done with this, what conclusions did we draw after we've looked at all the evidence and kind of figured it all out? Then you're going to want to go ahead and fill out that suspension report. When you are done with the suspension report, you should be prepared to share that in class tomorrow, as we are going to find out what actually happened.